The Syrian refugee crisis and how it affects the United States. My name is Olivia Kennedy, and I'm a sophomore political science major at Bloomsburg University. I chose to learn more about this topic because I believe it is important to highlight not only the conflict in Syria, but the way this impacts the rest of the world. The refugee crisis is a complex topic because there are many different approaches to dealing with the unfortunate situation. This presentation will explore the responses of the U.S. to this crisis. What is the Syrian refugee crisis? The Syrian refugee crisis began as pro-democracy protests sprung up in the southern city of Deira in March of 2011. These protests were inspired by the Arab Spring, which began in Tunisia. The Arab Spring was a set of anti-government demonstrations, including protests, uprisings, and even armed rebellion in response to oppressive regimes and lack of freedom in many parts of the Middle East. In response to these protests, the Syrian government under President Bashar al-Assad used deadly force to stop these protests. This resulted in a nationwide outcry for the president to resign from office. The president did not resign and continued on the crackdown of these pro-democracy movements. Eventually, the once peaceful protesters took up arms in defense, and civil war ensued. Many countries have gotten involved on both sides to try to end the conflict, but this has only made the situation more complex and difficult to resolve. Countries involved in the conflict. Some of these countries involved in the conflict are Russia, Iran, the UK, US, and France. Also, Turkey and Saudi Arabia have played a part in the fighting. Russia, which has previously had military bases in Syria, has launched airstrikes which are aimed at terrorists, but activists claim they regularly kill mainstream rebels and innocent civilians. These airstrikes have played a vital role in turning the war in favor of the government. Iran has spent billions and deployed thousands of troops in support of Assad's regime. The United States, United Kingdom, and France provided support for the moderate rebel groups, but these governments have prioritized non-lethal assistance since jihadists have become the dominant force in the armed opposition. Turkey supports the rebels, but has focused on using them to contain the Kurdish militia that dominates the Syrian Democratic Forces, claiming this militia is an extension of a banned Kurdish rebel group in Turkey. Saudi Arabia has armed and financed the rebels' armies specifically to counter Iranian influence in the war. All of these different interests in the war have exacerbated the fighting and made the Syrian conflict an even more impossible puzzle to solve. Results of the war. Like all war, the Syrian civil war has caused undue harm on all of its civilians. The death toll is disputed because of the lack of data, but somewhere between 371,000 and 570,000 people have lost their lives to this conflict. 1.5 million people have been left permanently disabled, 6.2 million Syrians have been internally displaced, and 5.7 million people have fled the country. 93% of these people have fled to neighboring countries including Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. According to these statistics, 55% of the entire pre-war population of Syria have fled the country. Additionally, 13 million people are in dire need of humanitarian assistance, and many are in hard-to-reach places. The results of the war in Syria are devastating. There have been 550 reported attacks specifically on medical centers. This is causing the death toll to rise considerably because of the lack of adequate medical care available. About a third of Syria's housing and half of its educational and medical facilities have been destroyed, according to a 2017 World Bank report. Where do they go? With all this destruction, a question remains: where can Syrians find safety? The three neighboring countries have taken in the most refugees, as these countries are the easiest to flee to. There are 1.6 million refugees in Turkey, and like most places, these people live in refugee camps, which lack the adequate funding to maintain them. In Turkey specifically, refugees are not able to work, which means they practically get by with no income, completely relying on aid from organizations that are in the area to help. There are 1 million refugees relocated in Lebanon and another 1 million in Jordan, which makes the refugees 25% of the total population. The U.S. has not had nearly as many refugees seeking safety here, mainly because the U.S. is hard to reach from the Middle East. It is crucial to note that the U.S. has given over $8 billion to assist those displaced in Syria. The impact of refugees on the U.S. The rising number of refugees seeking asylum in the U.S., along with other Western countries, has resulted in stricter policies on immigration in the U.S. The Trump administration has reduced the annual cap on immigrants allowed in the U.S. from the average 70,000 to just 30,000. The Obama administration had the cap at 110,000. This reduction is due to the extreme vetting processes and executive orders temporarily barring travel from select Muslim majority countries. To government officials, it is clear that the war has major costs on those looking for safety both here and in other parts of the world. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis has been quoted saying, "I've seen refugees from Asia to Europe, Kosovo to Africa. I've never seen refugees as traumatized as coming out of Syria. It's got to end." The travel ban. Perhaps the most apparent policy change the U.S. has taken part in during the refugee crisis has been the travel ban. This is an executive order put forth by President Trump that bans travel from 5 majority Muslim countries, also North Korea and Venezuela, although data shows visas have still been given to those from the 2 non-Muslim countries on the list. The travel ban shows the opinion many Americans have for these refugees, that they pose a danger to the American people and should not be allowed in the country. Of course, this is not how all people feel. After the travel ban was protested, many took to the streets to protest this order. Thousands of people gathered at various airports in the United States and around the world to prevent the returning of refugees and other visitors from the 7 countries considered unsafe. This shows the division of the United States' opinions regarding the Syrian refugee crisis. Of course, it is a multifaceted debate. Safety must be a top concern, so vetting is important, but it is also important to help people escape dangerous living situations. And for the living situation in Syria, dangerous is an understatement.